Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started then. And I will go up and bring, we'll just do a brief round of introductions. So Ted, we're going to start with you because I knew that you might have to pop out at some point. And so if you could just take a moment, Ted, to just kind of briefly introduce yourself. And then in the email I had sent out earlier this week, I'd asked everybody a couple of questions, kind of thinking about how you've dealt with uncertainty in the past, within a regulatory framework. And if you just wanted to give us a brief anecdote about, something that particularly sticks out in your mind, I would think it would be really helpful for the research team to hear that as well as everybody else.
Okay. Uncertainty within the regulatory framework, is that what you said?
Yeah, or just how you've, or just, you can think about it too, just how you've dealt with uncertainty in your career, because you can never know everything that you need to know. So, how have you dealt with that? Because a big part of scenario planning is kind of like dealing with uncertainty. So we just kind of want to get a sense of how people have dealt with that in the past, whether you've been consciously saying, how am I going to deal with this uncertain situation? Or, just...
Okay. So yeah, I can actually relate my uncertainties specifically to sage grouse in the bi-state, if that helps.
That would be great.
Okay. So anyway, Ted Cook, Nevada State Supervisor for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here in Reno. And it's my office that is making the decision whether to list the bi-state sage grouse. And so regarding uncertainties, the two uncertainties that we always face is, so we make an Endangered Species Act listing decision, we evaluate status and threats, and we compare them against 5 criteria listed in the Endangered Species Act and try to determine whether one or more of those criteria are met. If so, then we list. But for the potential of conservation efforts existing that we're persuaded are certain to be effective and certain to be implemented, then we could choose to not list, and that's where we're at in the bi-state sage grouse right now. So our uncertainties really center, we've done an assessment, we've determined that one or more of the factors were met, we've proposed the species for listing, and at the same time there's an action plan developed by a local area working group that we have a lot of confidence in, and our two uncertainties are related directly to we have a policy for evaluating conservation efforts, and the two uncertainties that I'm dealing with right now relate directly to those two factors. One is certainty of effectiveness, the other is certainty of implementation. And so we have a list of 79 projects developed by the working group and the technical team, and is that enough to remove threats to sage grouse, and will those 79 projects be implemented?
Mm-hmm.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
It does. It appears that my computer's doing things on its own. Thanks, Ted. Next, these slides are in no particular order, by the way. Patty, would you like to introduce yourself briefly? And I think that you would probably have some a great anecdote about uncertainty, given all the field work that you do. And it might be, am I going to make it to that next gas station?
Yeah. Well, the uncertainty is I can't get on to go to meetings right now. So
okay. Well, I have that. There's a picture of you up, so people have a picture of you.
Oh, great. Okay. So my name is Patty Novak-Etchnik, and I'm the State Rangeland Management Specialist for NRCS in the Reno State Office. So I've been here in Nevada for over 10 years now, and I've worked with NRCS for close to 20 years. We certainly have a lot of uncertainty working with livestock producers, and part of what we do is conservation planning. That is one of our main tools we use in NRCS, and I work primarily with the private ranchers, and so when we develop conservation plans, we always consider them as adaptive management. And so you develop a plan, you go do your inventories and collect all the data, put a plan together, and then we have drought, we have fires, we have flooding, insect infestations, and so part of that plan is a contingency plan to deal with those issues. And it's been pretty good to work with producers and talk about, okay, well, you lost all of your allotment. What's your next step? And so we try to give them guidance on that, and you know, whether they want to defer their grazing, do they want to find other alternative feeds, or should we be doing some grass banking? And so it's something that as a planner within RCS we always consider. So as for personal issues, well, I've been caught on the top of a mountain waiting for a helicopter that had broke down, and there we were. Are we going to spend the night or not? Our water is low. We're in the Mojave Desert. We're at 10,000 feet. And do you want to share your water with your coworker, or you want him to just die? Luckily, the helicopter did show up before dark. So I've had lots of crazy issues. 3 helicopter accidents, and I've lived to talk about them. So anyway, wow. Yeah.
I don't want to ask you what your decision would have been. Yeah.
If you ask my coworker, he'll tell you.
Well, hopefully he's not on this webinar. So.
No, he isn't.
Okay. All right. So Dale, I didn't have your picture, so you're my favorite stick man. Dale, are you still there?
Oh, pardon me. I had my mute on.
That's okay.
I guess I'm assuming Steve was planning to be on this call, and I got tapped to do it because he's off today. So
yeah,
I'm not.
He said something about a sage-grouse meeting that went long or got delayed.
He's not back from Reno. Anyway, so I'm not exactly positive what we're talking about today, but I guess I'll quickly figure it out.
Yeah, if you'll just give a brief introduction of what the agency, you work for the BLM, and but I don't really what your position is. That would be great.
Steve Nelson's old position. I supervise the biophysical resource group here at the Bishop Field office, which includes the biologists, the botanists, the range conservationists, those types of positions. And I've been working in the Eastern Sierra for about 25, 30 years.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Dale.
Sure.
Okay, and then I don't know, is Susan on yet? She mentioned she might be a little late, so if she joins us, we'll just come back. And then Jim?
Yes, hello. My name is Jim Winfrey. I'm a land management planner for the Forest Service on the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest. The project manager for our effort in preparing a land management plan RMP amendment to for the bi-state sage-grouse. So we're working on developing those regulatory mechanisms that are so needed. Based on the question that you provided earlier on, I would say just with the most recent experience with bi-state, I've been learning not to assume that I know everything in the attempt to not pigeonhole people in the future, 5, 10 years out, when new science comes, new methodologies are developed, or new techniques for things come about, and if we get into the stance that we know everything now, and we create specific management guidelines that adhere to those current techniques and that assumed knowledge, we are back in a position where we have to amend our forest plans again to allow us to do something new. And so I'm trying to have, cover both sides of that fence, where we want to have guidelines, standards and guidelines that can be implemented and that help us improve the conservation or enhancement of sage grouse and habitat, but also leave enough flexibility so that in the future new things can be adopted rather quickly and applied without having to go through an amendment process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Jim.
You're welcome.
And then we have Kelly.
Hi there. I'm battling a cold, so I might sound a little stuffed up. But I think spending over the past 20 years in resource management and resource restoration, natural resource projects, I think adaptive management is the key, because we can bring in the best science and the most knowledgeable folks, and still things don't always go our way, because the system's so dynamic that just one or two things can throw it out of whack. But that doesn't mean that we should just stop doing what we've been doing. Maybe make some adjustments. So I think just continual adaptive management, try to understand what we've done, and try to project where we might be headed, or what kind of trend we're seeing that we can address.
Okay, thanks. Kelly, do you want to tell folks just a little bit, for those who might not be familiar with what the Sagebrush Ecosystem Technical Team is?
Yeah, we're a multidisciplinary team of state employees. I represent the Nevada Department of Agriculture on the team. John Copeland represents the Nevada Division of Forestry. Melissa Fagelis represents the Division of State Lands. And Laura represents the Nevada Department of Wildlife. So we've been together for about 14 months. We've been participating in addressing concerns that were brought up about the alternative in the EIS, the state's alternative in the EIS, and also in addressing some issues, some shortfalls that were in our state plan as well. So we've been working diligently towards that end.
Okay, all right, thanks, Kelly. And then moving on to the research team, again, in no particular order. Greg, do you just want to briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Greg Garfin. I'm a climatologist at the University of Arizona, and I've spent a lot of time looking at climate impacts, working on drought and climate change, and planning for both of those, drought planning and planning for adapting to a changing climate.
Thanks, Greg. Oh, and Holly, your picture got a little pixelated, but...
Oh, that's fine. A little more pixelation won't hurt.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Holly Hartman. I'm director of the Airlands Information Center at the University of Arizona. I've been involved for a number of years in bringing climate and water information to stakeholders and decision makers, and figuring out how we can make that information more useful in decision making or engaging with stakeholders. I've been involved in scenario planning with the National Park Service, with other groups within the Bureau of Land Management, and some regional community planning organizations. And then in the development of this, I work also in the development of decision support tools. So that's enough for now, I think.
All right, thanks, Holly. And Julie? Julie, I think your mute's on. There you go.
Hi, I'm Julie Brugger. I'm an anthropologist. I I'm good now? Yeah. I work with Greg Garfin at Climate Assessment for the Southwest at the University of Arizona. Initially, my research was on, so I'm a social science researcher, and initially my research was on conflict over the use of public lands in the western United States. But more recently, I've been working on social science related to climate change, in particular perceptions of climate change and responses among rural communities. That's
Thanks,
all.
Julie. Then I'm not sure. Tim, did you join? Well, Tim wins the award for picture with the most beautiful background. I think this was recently taken in Tasmania. He spent 5 weeks in Australia and did, I think, a week in Tasmania while he was down there. But so Tim Brown, I work with at DRI. He's the director of the Western Regional Climate Center. And actually, was that Tim joining us right now?
Yes, after extensive technical difficulty.
All right. I was just introducing you, and I had mentioned that you were winning the award for picture with the most beautiful background.
Well, excellent. And that was the whole point, for people to look at the background, not at me.
Okay, good. Do you want to just briefly introduce yourself, Tim?
Sure. So, Tim Brown. I'm director of the Western Regional Climate Center and also our Climate Ecosystem and Fire Applications program here at DRI. And I don't know what have folks been saying more than that sort of stuff?
Yep. Nope, that's about it. Okay.
Okay, cool.
And then finally, sorry, I didn't have time to crop myself just in the picture, but so I'm Tamara Wall. I work with Tim at the Desert Research Institute, and my background is I'm actually a hazards geographer with an emphasis on wildfire. But since being at the Desert Research Institute, I've also done more work with climate, and particularly working with policymakers, decision makers, natural resource managers to kind of more effectively bring climate science into decisions. So with that, so Tim, just to give you a little overview, we asked all of the steering committee to give us a little bit about how they kind of deal with uncertainty in their jobs, and I just want to take a few minutes for the research team, particularly Greg and Holly, if there's anything that you want to add about kind of how uncertainty is dealt with in scenario planning. And then we'll move into a more formal, kind of presentation mode with about ACT and strategic scenario planning.
So who are you asking first, Greg and Holly?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think they have the best kind of overview of particularly Holly and how uncertainty is dealt with in strategic scenario planning. Or Holly, was that more a part of your presentation and you would like to keep it there?
Well, I'll mention a little bit where specifically scenario planning fits in compared to something like adaptive management. But then at the end, if we want to sort of loop back around and talk about, so what does it mean when you have such high uncertainty? The whole goal is to still be empowered to make decisions, even in the face of change that can overwhelm your best laid plans.
Okay.
And that there are definitely some strategies for doing that, decision strategies for dealing with uncertainty, but scenario planning fits in a specific piece of that.
Okay. And Greg, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No.
Okay. One of the questions we had a couple of questions for the steering committee members as well, and one of those was about structured decision making. Has anybody in the group kind of had formal or informal experience with structured decision making methodology?
I've had a little bit.
No.
No? Who was it that had a little bit?
That's Greg.
Okay. Anybody on the steering committee had familiarity with that? Okay. And then the other thing we wanted to get a little bit of a feel of before we kind of launch into the presentations was kind of your general familiarity with the the Central Great Basin Rapid Ecological Assessment, or RIA. If I just, go around a little bit really quick. So Ted, if you wanted to start, if you just kind of do you feel like you have pretty good familiarity with it? You know what the document is, or you have no idea?
I know what it is, and I've seen some both pretty and effective looking maps. And it seems important in supporting BLM and Forest Service decision making on resource management plan revisions, but that's it.
Okay. Patty?
Well, I've looked at the document, kind of gone through it, but I haven't really looked at any of the data. That was my question, is what kind of data that they did use, and so.
Okay.
But I am familiar with it, yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Patty. Dale?
Yeah, I'm fairly new into this position. I've heard of it, but I haven't really seen the data or anything. I haven't even seen the pretty maps that Ted has seen, so not much familiarity.
Okay. And Jim?
I've heard about it. I've heard people talking about it. I haven't really spent a whole lot of time delving deeply into it.
Okay. All right. Thanks. That helps us because it'll. Oh, I'm sorry. And Kelly. Apologize.
That's all right. I'm familiar with it. We have it here available to us, and I think we've all looked at it. I think it can be a real good tool.
Okay. All right. Thanks. That'll help us in particular for webinar 2 to kind of have a sense of how familiar people are with that document. So, Greg, I'm going to go ahead and pass the controls over to you.
So we're going to work from my desktop at this point?
Yeah. Do you think that would be the easiest? Because that way you can advance slides if you want to. Okay.
Yeah. No problem.
All right. So I've passed controls over to you now.
Okay. So can you all see that? Or maybe I should say just, yep, okay, very good. All right, so I'm going to describe a bit about this ACT framework, Adaptation for Conservation Targets, which was developed initially by a group that was coordinated through the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. And the objectives of applying this method are really to overcome paralysis on the topic of climate change and how to get to action, to improve multi-jurisdictional collaboration, because especially in the case of vegetation and wildlife, some of the suggested projected changes suggest that you can't take care of the problem by just managing your own piece of land, but there's a strong need for working with adjacent landowners. We focus on short-term, like the next 5, 10, 15-year actions to address the mid-century time frame. And the overall goal is to accelerate implementation of projects that can help the environment, species to adapt to changing conditions. So we all know that there are various kinds of treatments that we can do to resist change or improve the resilience of the environment, but the question becomes, how do we get there when we're talking about climate change? And so many plans use some version of an adaptive management cycle. And, just looking at the one of these in the upper left, identifying the changes relevant to the system, assessing vulnerabilities, and identifying strategies and prioritizing those, and then identifying opportunities for possible synergies, implement the options, monitor and reevaluate, and repeat the process. And the adaptation for conservation targets framework pictured here in a diagram basically follows that sort of adaptive management kind of cycle and builds in consideration of climate change. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But the process is documented in two papers, one on the framework itself and one on implementing that framework in some pilot projects. And I'll describe a little bit more about the pilot projects also. And Molly Cross from Wildlife Conservation Society is the lead author on both of those papers. So I'll be describing some work in these pilot projects from a group called Southwest Climate Change Initiative that was convened by the Nature Conservancy, and it's been a collaboration with Wildlife Conservation Society, Forest Service, National Center for Atmospheric Research, and several universities. And what we were able to do over a 2 or 3 year period was develop pilot projects in the Four Corners states in 4 different watersheds. And using a workshop that used this ACT framework as a point of departure for talking about climate change and adapting to climate change. And then the Nature Conservancy has been working with partners in the region on implementing some of the actions that were identified.
And just to interrupt for a second, if anybody has any questions for Greg, feel free to interrupt. You don't have to save them for the end.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
I think it would be more relevant to just jump right in. So sorry, Greg.
Thanks, Tamara. Yeah. So let me just we'll walk through the framework with an example. So we'll start here on the left side with the adaptation planning phase, and the first part is selecting a conservation feature and defining a management objective. So what we typically talk about in terms of features, it can be species, endangered or threatened species usually, a type of ecosystem, perhaps like alpine meadows, or a particular ecological function, like maintaining the role of fire on the landscape or maintaining flows for riparian areas. And in these pilot projects, we looked at several different species, including the Mexican spotted owl, the Gunnison sage grouse, the Bonneville cutthroat trout. We looked at these alpine areas in the Central Rockies. We did look at riparian flow and headwaters health in several of the projects, and also, also the role of fire on the landscape. So as an example, I'll focus in on our Gunnison River Basin project, where They looked at several different issues. One of them was the Gunnison sage grouse. Another was those alpine areas. Another was looking at water and hydrologic flows in tributaries to the main stem of the Gunnison. So one of the reasons that we worked in the Gunnison is that it has a high exposure to a changing climate. There's high biodiversity in the region. There are many species of concern. And there was a desire to build on the work of several of the partners in the area, the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, the Colorado Division of Wildlife, and a lot of research and monitoring and engagement with the public by federal agencies, including the BLM, the Park Service, and the Forest Service. So the objective in the sage grouse group at our workshop was one that they borrowed from an existing sage grouse working group and strategic committee. So they simply picked, they thought that it was just practical to use the same goal that this group had already articulated, which was to increase and maintain the Gunnison population of the grouse to greater than 3,500 individuals, and then to increase the population to 200 individuals for a subsidiary population. Step two, and so that objective was agreed upon by the group of participants, and that included several state agencies, federal agencies, NGOs, and a few private landowners. Step two is to assess the effects of climate change, and we start that process by building a conceptual model or an influence diagram, a wiring diagram, so that everyone can agree upon different aspects of the system and how they interact. We select a couple of future climate scenarios and then assess responses to those scenarios. So this is not for the Gunnison sage grouse. I didn't have a photo of that, but of that ad hoc diagram that we developed at the workshop. But this one kind of gives you the idea that it's sort of a messy process. But we generally come into the meetings with a skeleton idea of various aspects of the system, and then we can get folks at the meeting to add or subtract or change different aspects and add richness to the overall the diagram. And what this does is, first of all, it kind of sets a tone for collaboration among folks. Also, as everyone participates, they all start feeling a sense of ownership, and also agreement about some fundamentals about how the system works. So this difficult to read diagram is the one that we came up with in the sage grouse group at the Gunnison workshop, and I'll just walk through a couple of different parts of this, and I'll also mention that Gunnison was one of the earlier workshops, and we became a little more sophisticated about this sort of thing. And sophisticated, here's an example from another group. This one dealt with Bonneville cutthroat trout, but we had various kinds of color coding for things that were strictly climate, things that were intermediary, that were affected by climate, and so on. At any rate, going back to the sage grouse diagram, we looked at various kinds of influences. Some of the strictly climate influences included things like drought and how that affects snowpack and sage. And then there's an issue of dust deposition that accelerates snowpack melt in the Central Rockies. We considered some human influences as well, agricultural practices that might affect groundwater, possible shifts of water use from agricultural to municipal. We noted other kinds of human influences and also ecosystem influences, such as invasive plant species and leading to potentially altered fire regimes. We also looked at other ecosystem influences, tree and shrub encroachment, degrading some of the habitat, influence of carnivores and grazing on habitat, and so on. And then we looked at some direct influences, like the influence of temperature on various factors. The group broke down the concerns about the grouse into habitat concerns and then direct influences on the sage grouse itself. And they looked at these various factors: the brood-rearing habitat, the summer-fall habitat, lek habitat, and critical winter habitat, and again, how those previous things influenced various habitat factors. And then looping in from the top here was some of the issues about water and how that might change sage distribution, how all these things affect habitat and how they directly affect the sage grouse, and then how the Gunnison sage grouse connects to other related populations in the region. We then, once we had the wiring diagram established, we looked at some of the climate scenarios, and these, in this case, these were developed by Linda Mearns from the National Center for Atmospheric Research. So based on climate model studies that she'd analyzed, she came up with a moderate change scenario, and then a hydrologist, Joe Barsugli from NOAA, translated that into hydrologic changes using a hydrology model, and he looked at the amount of runoff, changes to snowpack and runoff timing and soil moisture. And then they also did a similar thing using a more extreme scenario. So for example, if you just look at the runoff amount for the moderate scenario, it was a 5 to 10% decrease. For the more extreme scenario, which had higher temperatures and lower precipitation, there was a much greater decrease in runoff and greater decreases in soil moisture and so on. And Joe modeled the changes to the hydrology. This is a hydrograph for the historic record in black, and then the two different scenarios and the different colors, and you can see the changes in amount and the timing of runoff and so on. So then we could apply qualitatively that knowledge back to our wiring diagram. We could add these plus and minus signs along with some comments about how we thought some of the different interactions might change based on the climate scenarios. Would things, be accelerated? Would we have, accelerated snowpack loss? How would that affect the magnitude of stream flow and then transport of sediment and nutrients and so on? We recorded all of these things in a table, and we looked at basically developing what we call hypotheses of change. So you had your climate-related driver, and I'll go into more detail using examples from the sage grouse group. And then you looked at the climate driver, you developed a hypothesis directly articulating the change of climate and how that affects things in the environment. And then we also noted comments as well. So here are some selected examples from the sage-grouse group, and I'll focus initially on this first line. So drought and hydrological impacts reduce snowpack. There's an earlier runoff and generally decreased water availability, including water in agricultural ditches and diversions and so on. And the hypothesis of change there is that less water, will lead to fewer mesic sites of lower quality. There may be shifts in the brood rearing habitat to higher elevations, and generally diminished chances of survival. And then we gave different uncertainty or likelihood ratings for the different scenarios. And it looks, like most of these are very highly likely, but if we go down to this next bottom line, fire, it's currently not a fire-prone landscape up there in the Gunnison Basin. And but with a possible increase in invasive grasses, there was, a notion that might increase fire frequency in habitats, but they noted that it was highly uncertain. The next phase was to identify intervention points and management actions. So if you think about that wiring diagram, each link in the wiring diagram is a possible intervention point, and a subset of those are ones where you could actually take management actions that might have some influence. So again, we're aiming for actions in the next 10 to 15 years to prepare for the mid-century time frame. And we looked at we started with the point of departure, the hypothesis of change that we had previously developed, and then the intervention point. Then we looked at what the possible actions might be for the two scenarios, and then we gave a qualitative urgency rating, which would help us later with prioritizing actions. So again, here are some of the hypotheses of change, intervention points, and actions. So I'll just focus on this top one again, the one that I'd previously described about brood rearing habitats. Here the intervention points were snowpack and groundwater management, agricultural practices, and public land management and policy. So the strategic action here was to retain water in the most vulnerable brood rearing habitats, with emphasis on hay meadows, seeps, and springs. And possible actions, for example, with agriculture might be to improve water use efficiency, and then to do some restoration work on seeps and springs, and so on. The next step in the adaptation planning phase is prioritizing actions. So in this case, we wanted to look at some different measures of feasibility. We looked at barriers and opportunities, economic, political, social, and we also asked the participants to identify who else needs to participate in this multi-jurisdictional setting in order to achieve success. And then we also looked at potential barriers, including people's attitudes, gaps in biophysical or management science, and needs for perhaps for visualization in order to make the point to various audiences. And again, here are some examples from a table. So if our action is to retain water in the most vulnerable habitats, some of the barriers are the high cost, There's some political issues in the Gunnison Basin with regard to this. The group was confident about this, but they also thought that you'd need greater capacity, more people on the ground, and more monitoring. Some of the opportunities is that there were some co-benefits for other aspects of the system, such as the hydrology of riparian areas. If it works, the thought was that politicians would support it, and that there'd be benefit in coordination and collaboration. And then to be successful, they mentioned that they might need politicians to lobby for resources, and they definitely needed the input and participation of federal agencies, some NGOs, and some state agencies, and some private landowners as well. And so ultimately, when they prioritized all of the actions, this one rose to the top. And this is the one, in fact, they noticed some opportunities to implement this, which included that BLM had already started initiating some restoration activities. There was a possibility of getting seed funding. And then there were other groups like this group. There were some other activities such as removing some pinon and juniper encroachment on the sagebrush habitat, and that a group had gotten funding to do that, and all of those things seemed to line up and would be able to help. Finally, I just want to mention that at every step of the way, there's a need to go back and reconsider whether it's possible to even achieve the objective. And one of the things that the group noted when they looked at the more extreme scenario, they noted that there might be cases where the conditions deteriorated so much that you would need heroic sort of actions like bringing in artificial irrigation to brood rearing habitats, or perhaps assisted migration of populations to higher elevation, or planting more drought-tolerant species or ecotypes from lower elevations, and so on. And then on the implementation side, the steps are pretty clear-cut, implementing priority actions, and then, of course, implementing monitoring as well and adjusting actions as needed, and then revisiting the plan again to make sure that you can achieve your objective. So just to follow up, what the group actually did after the workshop was they developed what they called the Gunnison Climate Working Group. The group pulled together to develop a vulnerability assessment, a more detailed and formal vulnerability assessment for the region. And then they garnered some funding for various kinds of activity. And I should just mention that this working group has a really broad participation. Again, there are federal agencies like the BLM, Forest Service, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, NRCS. There are some state groups like Colorado Parks and Wildlife. There's NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, some research groups as well, the Gunnison Stock Growers Association, and a water conservation district as well. One of the things that they ended up doing, one of their strategies was to try to improve some of the habitat where there was down cutting, and they thought that it would also help the grouse. So they ended up getting funding, and they've put in a number of gabion kind of small dams that allow water to flow but retain sediment and moisture, and they thought that that would help improve some of the habitat. So coming out of these workshops, we surveyed people, and some of the things that they valued was that the process was not depressing, that they got a good infusion and update on the science, and they appreciated a lot of the sharing of information. They liked the way that in the process you can deconstruct this very complex set of problems into bite-sized pieces that could be implemented. And they also thought that overall using this kind of collaborative process would be valuable in developing partnerships. Some shortcomings of this method, and these are my reflections on this, is that having a very narrow focus on a single process or species could lead to maladaptations if you don't think through very well the connections to other species and other parts of the system within your watershed. We only looked at a single time horizon, that mid-century time frame, so we really didn't look at the need for evolving kinds of actions. And then even though we did have some outside-the-box suggestions, kind of, such as bringing in artificial irrigation or doing assisted migration kinds of actions, we really had to push people to pretty hard to think outside the box. So it's not conducive to that kind of thinking. And that's it. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Greg, would you want to pass me back the controls?
Okay.
Or can I do that? Can I just take them? Maybe I can just take it back. I think I can do it. I think I just took it back.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Great.
So just I finally found and thanks Susan for joining us. I saw that you came in there. I finally found the original one page, and I just wanted to pull this up really quick down at the bottom of it. So what Greg just went through was over here on the right side, ACT. And what Holly's going to go through next is, the strategic scenario planning, which has a much different approach. And our overall vision for this, and what what we would like to get your input on over the next couple of weeks, to a month or so, is all leading towards a workshop where we're going to integrate these two processes. So we're planning a 2.5-day workshop, with approximately 25 people from the area, hopefully having a very good representation between, multiple agencies and organizations. But one day in that workshop will be spent kind of tackling a problem that we will come up with using ACT. The second day will be spent tackling the same problem with SSP. And then there'll be a half-day follow-up. It'll look like kind of integrating those two and kind of sussing out where the strengths and advantages and disadvantages of both of those processes were, and looking at that concern or issue. So I just wanted to pause in the middle there to kind of bring it back to what we hope to do with this. And so this is just a brief overview to start getting you familiar with ACT and SSP. And then we'll wrap up today's webinar with talking a little bit about what potential process, species, or issue the steering committee feels like it might be good to focus on. So does anybody have any questions for Greg? It's all crystal clear? Because the first time Greg showed me that, I was just like, what did you just say, Greg?
Well, it should be pretty familiar to anybody who's, thought about adaptive management. It's not that far off from, typical adaptive management thinking.
Yeah, so Kelly, does it have a ring of familiarity to you?
Yes, it does.
All right. So Holly, if I pass controls to you, do you want to tackle SSP?
All right.
Which does not look like adaptive management.
Well, there's some places that they intersect, all right, and we'll cover that. But it does have a different look, yeah. All right, so you should be seeing a slide now that says scenario planning to support climate change adaptation.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so like Tamara says, scenario planning, in particular we're talking about strategic scenario planning, has a little bit different emphasis than the ACT framework that Greg just covered. In particular, it is focused on the uncertainties rather than the certainties. We first started looking at how to maybe use this to support climate change adaptation in natural resource management with the National Park Service in 2007 for Joshua Tree National Park. And they've taken it up and are using it throughout their system now to look at climate change challenges and how they might deal with that. You can look at from these pictures here, you can kind of see the challenge. If you look in the upper left, you see the Joshua trees there now. And when you look at what could happen with regard to climate change, it's not that there's a particular future that's most likely. There are a number of futures that could happen. The climate could change in different ways that would be of different character and pose different kinds of challenges for resource managers and communities around Joshua Tree National Park. So you're looking at something, for example, becoming more like the Sonoran Desert rather than the Mojave Desert. Like you can see up in the upper right. You're looking at something that may be becoming more of a fire-dominated system with annual grasses, like you can see in the lower left. Or you can look at a climate future that is sort of this inexorable drying that leads to a conversion to more of a dune system. And you can't necessarily say that any one future is more likely than the other, with the exception of what future is the least likely, and that is a persistence of the current Joshua Tree National Park ecosystem, the climate in the ecosystem. And then the other challenge is if you think about the kinds of changes that you're seeing here in these pictures, do you think that anything else is staying the same in terms of the challenges facing nearby communities, economies? And there are going to be other challenges maybe that may be seen as more of a higher priority elsewhere around the country. So scenario planning is designed to kind of deal with this level of change. And in particular, it's looking at how can we deal with decisions that may require really long lead times, so that we don't get into having to make a change really kind of on the fly and not having the flexibility that's required? Or how do we avoid maladaptive decisions that seemingly look like they're good in the short run, but that would set us up for problems down the road? And then we'd like to have a process that's efficient enough that we can revisit the process whenever we need to, rather than on this 10 or 15 or 20 year large-scale intensive planning kind of timeline. So we're trying to get at an efficient process that can involve a number of different organizations, but you can restart it whenever there's new information or new uncertainties. And I want to make a distinction between some different kinds of scenario planning or scenario approaches that are commonly encountered. The one I'm focused on is the one in the middle with the Joshua Tree pictures that you saw earlier. But often we see the word scenario planning referred to the use of these downscale climate model projections, where you're just looking at possible ensembles or sets of climate model outputs that have been downscaled to a particular region, and then we run them through hydrology models or terrestrial ecosystem models, and then different kinds of management models, and are looking at the different implications. These are more akin to sensitivity studies. And then if you go back to that very beginning of the chain of models, the climate change projections are themselves based on qualitative scenarios, more aligned to the kind of just mentioned with Joshua Tree National Park, where there are stories, qualitative stories about the way that economies and emissions policies and technology and social values and so on may play out over the decades that are just fundamentally not predictable in a quantitative sense. And then the other kind of scenario studies or scenario planning that you hear about is referred to over here on the right. And it's more of the community planning approach, where you're looking for common visions or common goals for a community. And the goal is to reduce the social uncertainty once a decision's been proposed. You're trying to reduce the probability or possibility that people will try to disrupt the decision. So you're trying to get people to agree on what their common vision or goals are. And often at the end of that, nowadays, folks are saying, is our common vision robust to climate change, rather than incorporating climate change as part of the process itself. So I'm specifically talking about a scenario planning that emphasizes uncertainty across a range of conditions, whether it's climate, whether it's social uncertainty, and others. And the overall goal is to foster strategic thinking about the future, about how we might respond to different possibilities. Its goal is to challenge the thinking. When Greg got done with his talk, you mentioned that the ACT process, they had some trouble maybe getting people to think outside the box. The whole goal of this process is to get people to think outside the box. The scenarios that are developed aren't so important in and of themselves. They're simply a tool for fostering strategic thinking. And what we're doing are building these stories about the different ways in which the future might evolve and how decisions might be played out. And the goal is to come up with stories that are plausible, that are internally consistent, and that tell a meaningful story for management. And you can see over here on the chart on the right side where I'm just distinctly distinguishing scenario planning from adaptive management. And the idea is that both adaptive management and scenario planning are ways to deal with high levels of uncertainty, whether it's about the state of the science or about the future. But scenario planning recognizes that oftentimes managers don't have as much control over those forces of change or the response to those to forces of change as you might like. Adaptive management says that you can control and test different approaches and then implement that over time. But scenario planning says that these external drivers, these forces of change, may swamp out anything that you might do. So we're taking more of a contingent perspective about the future. What we're specifically not doing is making predictions or forecasts for the future. And then the scenarios, we're not trying to come up with the most likely future. And in fact, we're looking for futures that some may be unlikely, but they would have significant impacts. So maybe low probability, but high impact. So another way to think about this scenario planning is it's not just strategic thinking, but the process itself that we go through is to try to create systematic creativity, because it does connect to a creative process as well as a science-based process. So you can see here on this graph where we're looking at the level of uncertainty, but we're looking at the complexity of the problem as well, where we have to go beyond simply using projections and model studies. We certainly make use of those, but we have to go beyond those because the models don't include all of the uncertainties about the future that may be important for us, or they may extend past the abilities of those models to handle some of the possibilities. So we're really going beyond projections and maybe even bringing in some exploratory work rather than just simply using projections. So the scenario planning process recognizes that maybe in a more standard planning and management process, you kind of take stock of where you are, you figure out where you want to go, and you figure out what are your leverage points and how you might get to and achieve your vision. But scenario planning recognizes that there's a lot of forces outside of your control. Climate is one of them, but there are others, and the REA references several of those, including development and land use, and then invasive species, but certainly policies, the economy, budgets, and social values and expectations are also forces that can really affect management of public resources at both short and long time scales. And just to kind of put this scenario planning in context of this overall adaptation challenge, you can take a look at this kind of four different levels of climate uncertainty, with the most certain types of things on the top and going to increasing uncertainty as you go towards the bottom. And scenario planning in particular is useful for focusing on what could happen, which includes new extremes that we haven't seen before, and shifts in overall climate envelopes or climate distributions. And then we can look at what's unlikely but possible, which may be unforeseen or unexperienced climate regimes. And just to provide you a couple of examples, sort of concrete examples, here up on the upper left is a plot of northern hemisphere land temperatures for June, July, and August. The black, red, orange, and green lines are all from 1951 to 1981. You can kind of see that whole distribution of temperature centered around kind of that long-term average. And this just shows the variation of temperatures, the distribution of temperatures over those decadal periods. And then you can see in the blue and the purple, as time goes on, as we get into more recent decades, how that climate envelope is shifting, so that we're seeing more extremely high temperatures in the summer over the whole northern hemisphere, and that we're seeing what had been unusually high temperatures now becoming much more common. So that you can see, for example, over here where it shows even 3, 4, and 5 standard deviations out from the mean, we're now seeing temperatures just outside the historical distribution before 1981, and that what had been very unusually high temperatures, occurring less than 5% of the time, are now occurring almost, say 20% of the time over 2001 to 2011. So a shift in the climate envelope. And this is for the whole northern hemisphere, but I know for Arizona, the plot for this looks very much the same. I'm not sure about Nevada, but for Arizona, it's very much the same. And another example is here for Boulder, Colorado daily precipitation, ranking the 24-hour precipitation from the smallest values in the historical record up to the largest values. And you can see kind of this usual curve like you would expect to see. And then what happened in September of last year? We got an extreme event that was just outside the envelope. We're in a different kind of situation altogether in terms of 24-hour precipitation, in terms of the extreme. So we're seeing just extremes not previously witnessed, not expected based on historical conditions. And scenario planning is specifically aimed at dealing with these kinds of uncertainties. So there's a sort of 3 big phases in scenario planning. We've already started working on the first one, just preparing for the process. There's a lot in common with other processes. There's not a lot particularly unusual there. But I want to focus today on just what are the steps in actually building and refining the scenarios. The next step is, once your scenarios are built, how do you use them to evaluate, prioritize, and implement management actions? And that's kind of the next phase of the project that we're just starting. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, but I'm happy to talk about it if people want to in more detail. But I'm going to focus on just how we go through the process of building and refining the scenarios. So the first piece has a lot in common with what Greg's process was, is where we're looking at the scope of the project and the focus question, and then identifying key external drivers. And the scope of the questions may be a little bit different than under the ACT process. Often we're looking at a regional spatial extent rather than a small area. And in the scenario planning projects I've been involved with, people are looking out to the end of the century, not because they're going to plan, not because they're coming up with actions to implement at the end of the century, but they're trying to look at the implications of actions in the more near term to see whether you're you're producing sort of long-term maladaptation, or whether you're missing opportunities for making decisions that would have long lead times. And then in thinking about what the focus question is, it's not so much about a particular species, but rather in a general sense, looking at some different focus questions. The most simple kind of question that folks often have are, what are the possible impacts of climate change? But that's not necessarily the useful question. It's more about, are our current management approaches sufficient given possible changes? How should we manage given the uncertainty of the future? And then the most powerful question generally is do our management objectives need to change over the future given prospective changes in climate and other forces? The most effective kind of question really is at that intersection of the things that we know and the things that are not predictable. And then what are the things that we can control, and then what are the things that are outside of our control? So for scenario planning, we emphasize those things that are not predictable and not controllable. And then they intersect with the things that are better known and where you have control. So there's some things that are in the process that are very common to what Greg presented, and that is, one is identifying these key external forces of change or external drivers. The tables that Greg showed can be used as input to this process. The tables that I show here are from the National Park Service's scenario planning handbook on using scenarios for climate change adaptation. And so one table focuses on what are the climate variables. You can create tables like this for other kinds of forces of change, like economic change, looking at budgets, or changes in social expectations, changes in regulatory policy or land use change, and so on. And you look at the literature or other reports or an assessment of the expertise of the group to come up with a table of the drivers of change, and then you have impacts tables as well. The key difference from the ACT process that Greg presented is that while we have the tables, when it comes time to developing the scenarios, we focus on those entries that have high uncertainty rather than the ones that are highly likely or highly certain. Right? Those are what we're using. The highly uncertain variables and impacts are the ones that are highly uncertain variables, and with high impact are the ones that we're focusing on to build the scenarios. Another way to identify the key external drivers is through the use of the wiring diagrams or influence diagrams, systems models, or whatever you want to call it, that Greg mentioned. This is an example from Southeast Arizona where these diagrams were already developed. We can make use of those, and we're looking for specific characteristics of these diagrams. And in particular, you can see up in the top in the orange, we're looking for variables that have impacts on a lot of other parts of the system, so that if you had a change there, it would have widespread impact through the system. We're also looking at something like you can see at the star that's the lowest down is the loss of perennial water, where there would a particular variable crosses a threshold, and that threshold would produce change of much different character. When you lose perennial water, that system is going to be very different than if you still have perennial water there. So we're looking at kind of threshold effects. And then we're also looking at cycles and feedbacks, like you can see here up in the grassland degradation cycle. Whereas if any of these, any kind of stressor on the system may start a change that has positive feedbacks or amplifying feedbacks that just create more and more and more change, and that you could fundamentally change the character of your system. For example, the degradation or loss of grasslands, that you end up with a type conversion to something like a dune system, for example. So we're looking for specific parts of the system that may change in big ways. So the next set of steps is to identify those critical drivers and then create the scenarios. There are a number of different ways to do it. We focus on the use of the quadrant approach or nested quadrants. It doesn't really matter, but that's an efficient approach. It's one that the National Park Service has used to good effect. The goal is to not try to describe every possible future, but to select 3 to 5 possible futures that are very different from each other and that will provide management challenges that are different in character. Because again, the idea is to spur creative thinking and strategic thinking. And so once we've identified 3 to 5 possible scenarios, then we spend time building those scenarios out in more detail. And in particular, we think about how you go from the present day to your time horizon, with kind of describing how the change happens, because we have to make sure that it's logically plausible. And then we turn those scenarios into stories, compelling stories that you can connect with the interest of stakeholders and decision makers at different levels, whether it's at the kind of executive level or across different organizations and so on. And then we have some techniques for evaluating the scenarios before you actually start using them in developing management plans. So just to provide an example, I want to go through an example that we've been involved with in the Cienegas watershed in southeast Arizona. The Cienegas watershed is a typical southeast Arizona area that encompasses high elevation forests, grasslands, and deserts. It covers a number of different jurisdictions, including BLM, the National Park Service, National Forest Service, county lands, state trust lands, private lands, and so on. There's the different organizations that have been managing in that area have really good relationships built up over the long run based on adaptive management processes that they've put into place. They've got regular processes for revisiting their plans, engaging with the external community, and they've even gone to the next step for inadaptive management to recognize that their goals may need to change over time. And they use what you can see here in the bottom right, this concept of nested objectives that says we may have some very finely honed objectives like particular species composition that we can meet if the future looks like what we've experienced in the past. But if change is too great, that we may have to retreat towards more fundamental objectives like just having ground cover, or at the most basic level just having watershed health and having carbon and water storage. And so they've incorporated that all into their adaptive management planning, but they still felt like they weren't prepared for the pace and scale and scope of climate change over the longer term. And they were seeing changes that were really kind of outside their range of, outside their expectations. So they wanted to look at scenario planning as a way to deal with the uncertainties they were concerned with. So what we started with was regional climate scenarios. These regional climate scenarios were developed through the process that I've just described, only it was developed by climate and impact scientists associated with the climate assessment for the Southwest, based at the University of Arizona. As part of a retreat workshop, they went through this same scenario planning process where they identified key drivers of climate change in the Southwest, and then identified sort of the dominant drivers of change and created some scenario logics using the quadrant method. So you can see up here in these orange diagrams, we had 2 different teams. They went through and ranked the different external forces of change for Southwest climate on these plots for uncertainty and impacts. So they were in, the one on the left was looking at things like tropical storms becoming stronger and more frequent as being the highest uncertainty but having the highest impact. And then something like a drier spring having a high impact but having a lower uncertainty. And then the one on the right, it showed, again, flooding from Pacific hurricanes as being highly uncertain, and winds as being highly uncertain and having high impact. And something like snowmelt, changes in snowmelt being important but having less uncertainty. That's more of a certain change. And so they ended up with two sets of quadrants that describe each set of quadrants describes 4 possible scenarios. So we had a total of 8 possible scenarios to look at. There were some things common across all of these quadrants, like in all of them temperatures are increasing, the temperature extremes are increasing, we're crossing environmental thresholds, we're getting earlier spring runoff, our growing seasons are extended and the fire seasons extended and so on. But what's unique about these scenarios is the role, say, of winter precipitation, the role of tropical cyclones, or the timing of the start of the monsoon season, whether it's early or late, and then the role of winds from either local winds increasing in the summer or having these large-scale wind systems in the spring. So not all 8 of these are particularly important for the southeast Arizona. For example, one that brings more snow is important for the high elevation areas of Arizona, but not necessarily for southeast Arizona. So the Cienegas group chose 3 of these scenarios to work with in their region. We describe those a little more fully. I'm not going to go into detail about them here, other than to show you can see from these pictures that they're a fundamentally different character. It's not just a sensitivity study about if we get temperatures or runoff decreasing a lot or a little. It's that the climate posed by these scenarios are really different in kind of what kind of future they pose. So in one case, we've got a lot of disruptive events from fire and flood associated with the late monsoon and these large tropical cyclones. The one in the middle is just inexorable drying and more windiness, just persistent and an increasing drought. And then in the other is an early and longer monsoon season with a more benign climate but under increasing temperatures. So we might look something more like parts of humid Mexico. So then to bring this down to the Cienegas region in southeast Arizona, we do a number of activities. The way that they were organized was that they had 4 different resource teams. One focused on riparian issues, one focused on montane or high elevation issues, one focused on upland issues, which are just whatever is between the riparian areas and the high elevation areas, and then cultural resources. Each group participated in a workshop at the same time but focused on their own issues. They went through a series of activities you can see here to identify their management challenges, hone in on a focus question, think about past surprises that have happened and the kind of adaptive responses that came about from those surprises, considering different kinds of future change, not just climate, because the climate change was already created by the regional climate team, but they were looking at possible political changes, economic changes, technological changes, legal and environmental changes that would have a high impact for them, but from their perspective are outside of their control. They also then mapped the system, looked at some of those wiring diagrams or influence diagrams that Greg was referencing. And then they created the impact and uncertainty plots like you've just seen for climate. And then they created their scenario logics and then built those narratives out to then be able to respond to it. So here's what came up for the upland system. They started off with a focus question of just how can we maintain effective ground cover to sustain our ecosystem function. That was their original question. So then when they looked at the three, then they went through, not focused on climate issues, but on all those other kinds of drivers of change. They looked at possible drivers of change, identified ones that had high uncertainty and high impact up here on the upper right hand, where you can see energy development, winter. They did put in winter precipitation, the effectiveness of different invasive species eradication techniques. Temperature change has high impact but has relative low uncertainty, and development has high impact but relatively low uncertainty. So from this diagram, they ended up with 2 dominant drivers identified. They kind of synthesized some of those and then turned them into these 2 axes. So one was looking at environmental laws. Do the current requirements, say for endangered species and development controls, continue to exist, or are they removed? Because in this region, there's a lot of pressure to remove some of those regulations. And then they were looking at funding issues as being really uncertain out over the long run, but having a lot of impact. So they looked at funding being consistently available, but it's just persistently not enough funding. Or they're looking at boom and bust funding. That is, you get plenty of money sometimes, maybe more than you can use, but it happens in real distinct pulses. You've got to figure out how to make the best use of that when you can get it. So that creates 4 different possible futures, not driven by climate, but driven by these other kinds of forces of change for them. And so what we did then is nested their upland scenarios inside these climate scenarios. So for the 3 climate scenarios they chose, No Analog, Tucson Good Old Days, and Habubi Trap, they nested their quadrants inside of that. That gives them a possible 12 scenarios to build out, but they selectively chose 3, the ones that are in red, the combination that's shown in red, and they chose those based on which ones were most different and that would pose significantly different kinds of management challenges. So then the next step was to actually build those out and to think about how that evolves over time and what their implications are. So this is the story for the upland area where they're looking at consistently low funding, trying to achieve, comply with current laws, but they're looking at inexorable drying of the region, increased windiness and drying. So in the short run, they've got fire risk and grass mortality issues, and then in the mid-range, conversion to shrubs and scrubs, which affects their fuel load and fire risk and the ability to maintain ground cover. And then if that were to continue, there would inevitably be a loss of soil productivity and a scoured landscape. So the management challenge is how to transition the cover types with minimal soil exposure, regardless of the species, and still try to meet your ESA obligations. So in response to this scenario, they focused on this specific management challenge. For the other scenario, one of the others was where they're looking at consistently low funding, but some of the development laws and other laws being removed, and then looking at an early monsoon season and kind of what you consider a more benign climate without a lot of extremes, but this inexorable rising of temperatures. So you've got favorable precipitation, but seasonal shifts in phenology and other things, but this kind of land speculation, land development, maybe mining, and a lot of activities that facilitate the spread of some of our problem invasive species, and then looking at increasing groundwater stress and a change in your dominant vegetation type, and with some real implications for the presence of your threatened and endangered species. And under this situation, their challenges is how do you ensure persistence and expansion of native vegetation when you've got these development pressures without the regulations, existing regulations to control that, even if you've got what might be considered a productive climate. So it's a very different kind of challenge for this scenario. And then the last one is where you've got your current regulations, but you've got this more transient funding, so boom and bust funding, but then you've got a climate that's unlike something that's been experienced in that region so far, where you've got a really late monsoon and then these an increase in the frequency of these tropical cyclones that can really bring massive amounts of precipitation to the area in a short amount of time. So you're looking at just constant disruption of the system, not every month or every year, but the frequency of disruption increases over time. So ultimately you end up with a challenge that says, how can we use surge funding effectively to deal with continuous disruption and disturbance, including things, extreme events, and fire, because they have the late monsoon. So from that, those are three very different possible futures. And from that, then, the question is what set of options might you come up with that could fit all three of those futures, or which ones do you need to put into place to meet the challenges of a specific future, to be prepared for that future alone if that one were to come about. So that's where you really focus on how to use the scenarios then to, whether it's to evaluate, prioritize, and or implement different management actions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here unless you want to talk more about this, but just the process that I've described so far, just creating those scenarios, really brings a lot of insight to the participants about the ways the future can be quite different. And that alone turns out to have a lot of value. And that the insight that folks get from this process can right away be used in discussions with stakeholders and other decision makers. It can be used to direct further modeling studies, for example, to see whether current models can actually accommodate some of the really different kind of characteristics in some of these futures. You can use them to conduct vulnerability assessments, and then you can connect to different agency plans like the Park Service's resource stewardship studies or the REA and so on. Another kind of outcome from this process of just using the scenarios or creating the scenarios is that you can take a look at existing plans, things that you already have underway, and be able to say, to assess those plans, are they really as robust as you think they might be? So you can look for each of those, say, each of those three scenarios and say whether the plans really work under all three of them. Or you can look at individual adaptation options and see whether you would lead, if some of them would lead you to being kind of locked into something that's maladaptive over the long run, even though it's good in the short run. And then lastly, the area in gray is kind of the big payoff, but it takes more effort, and that's really kind of phase two that we'd hope to come through with on this project, is about innovating new adaptation options, and not just new options to be implemented, but to identify under what conditions you would stop doing things that you may be doing now, or how do you bridge from things that may be useful only for a limited time in the future, but you need kind of a bridge before you implement something very different out in the longer run. So thinking about bridging kind of actions. And the ultimate goal is to come up with a portfolio of options that you can change your level of investment or commitment to those options in a portfolio as the scenarios play out or prove to not be appropriate, but other ones prove to kind of you're following along the track of some of those scenarios. So I can leave it there, or I can talk more if you want about what kinds of things might go into those portfolios, if that's important at this time. But otherwise, the big focus was on the process itself.
Yeah, I think we'll have to leave it there, Holly, just so we can wrap up in time. But thanks, that was a great overview of, and to Greg as well, that was a great overview of both processes. Does anybody have any questions for Holly or Greg after kind of getting the comparison between these two? Okay. Yeah, I know it's a lot to take in, but this is kind of the introductory webinar, and I know particularly for Jim and Susan, because you are two planners in the group. Does this resonate with you at all, or does it seem just like a little bit too much to take in at this time?
So this is Susan. I mean, it does resonate with me, and I guess I'm looking forward to just when we have the workshops and can really maybe get into some more concrete examples and all, and really start working through this.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's the the goal of the project is to actually take a group of people through both of these processes, which is typically both of these, if we had our druthers, so to speak, we would have a workshop for ACT and then a workshop for SSP, and they would be both be like a 2-day workshop. So we're using the webinars and your help to kind of condense the process down a little bit so that we can fit both into a 2.5 day workshop and have the ability to wrap that up. The last thing I wanted to do today, and I did want to mention so it doesn't get lost at the end, is the tentative dates we have for the workshop are June 25th, 26th, and 27th. And Patty, I know that that's fully in your field season. You know, so we can talk about that offline as well. But you know, your role is you know, really to give us, I think, feedback, you know, going up to the workshop. You know, and if you can make that, that would be fantastic. But we do fully realize that that's in the middle of your field season.
Okay.
So we're just kind of throwing out those as tentative dates. And then I have the other dates for the remaining webinars lined out with the research team, and I'll be sending out a doodle poll, actually 3 separate doodle polls for those probably this weekend, so we can get these scheduled out a little bit more farther in advance than we did this one, so people can get it on their calendars. But the last thing we wanted to talk about today in preparation for webinar 2, where if Holly, I'm gonna take
Sure.
the presenter controls back. So if you should be seeing the timeline down on the bottom there, and so what we're looking at is having webinar 2 in kind of early May, and it's actually kind of developing those wiring diagrams in a preliminary way. And so our questions for the steering committee at the end of this webinar is, you know, essentially, do we have any nominations for any processes or species that you think would be particularly valuable to focus the workshop on? And I'll go ahead and pull up this. So all right, did we lose Ted, by the way? I know he had to jump off at one point. All right, well, I'm never shy about picking on people. So Kelly, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. Well, I would definitely say I think this is going to really work well when we start talking about our low elevation loss of winter habitat, Wyoming NZIS, and then eventual domination by an annual grass like cheatgrass, and how we can adaptively react to that, to those changes. And also our upland meadows, our mesic areas, we all know what significance they play in the sagebrush ecosystem for nearly all of our species. So that type of habitat, and I would say all the species that are somewhat dependent upon the sagebrush ecosystem, with maybe a focus on the greater sage-grouse in this area anyway.
I mean, the focus of this project is the Central Great Basin. So it's, you know, it's not the entirety of the Great Basin, but the Central Great Basin.
Okay. So yeah, pinyon juniper encroachment.
Patty, what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with Kelly. You know, the pinyon and juniper encroachment and cheatgrass are certainly issues, and all related to the sagebrush ecosystem and all of those plants and animals that are dependent on that system.
So a question for Greg and Holly. I mean, I know there's differences between ACT and SSP, but how narrow or how broad do we kind of want to take this for the conceptual models to start with? Like, do we need to say we're going to focus on habitat loss and, low elevations and cheatgrass dominance, or does it need to go as narrow as, we're going to focus on, sage grouse habitat in high priority areas?
We could probably, so ACT will probably be more successful with that second level of specificity that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And for scenario planning, our experience to date is that a more integrative approach seems to be what's helpful for folks. That's where they tend to be, because there are few other processes that help you integrate other kinds of forces, not just climate, or that taking a broader view provides more insight and then opportunities for doing different kinds of management. But scenario planning as a process for strategic thinking is not limited to those broad integrative issues. So I'm sort of agnostic about what people choose to focus on, because that will be kind of the issue. Is that's kind of one of the parts of the research questions for this project. Is would a highly focused question still would the process still be useful for a highly focused question? And there's nothing about the process itself that says it wouldn't be.
Mm-hmm. So from the steering committee, do you guys have a preference, or do you think what would be, most useful for the region? Would it be to stay very narrow and very specific, or would it be best to go really broad, or a combination? Like, do you guys have any inclination that way, one way or the other? Again, I'm going to pick on the planners in the group, just to give you a heads up.
This is Jim. My perspective is that take that picture down. The idea is to, we're working with a broad group of people with different interests. So I would see starting at a broad level and seeing where those discussions take the scenario planning or the ACT, and then focus off of those discussions.
Do you have any thoughts on a particular process or species to focus on, or one that might be of major concern for the area?
Well, there's my favorite species right now, which is the bi-state sage grouse.
Mm-hmm. Because one of the advantages is that we have the RIA, which already has, an abundance of information to help support this process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the activities that we do for the strategic scenario planning is we start off by trying to define that, to hone in on that focus question. And so we have an activity where we actually have people pose different questions at different scales. So you kind of start at what you kind of a mid-range kind of scale, and then you go up to maybe a 30,000 or 50,000 foot level, and then you go then also down farther into the weeds at a real local, a real specific level, and kind of list all of the different kinds of management challenges or possible focus questions, just to get them all out. And then from that mix, then people can decide on kind of which question or a synthesis of several questions they'd want to use as their focus.
Yeah, I could see a lot of benefit in doing that with I could see a lot of benefit in doing that.
Yeah. So Tamara?
Yeah.
It's Ted.
It took me too long to unlock my phone to turn off the mute to reply to you earlier.
Okay.
And I think we're going to be wrapping up here in the next 3 minutes or so, it looks like. Is that correct?
Yeah, as soon as I see a yellow school bus go by my house, I literally have to, I will suddenly be gone, and I will just run out the door and go grab my daughter. You guys can continue, and I'll be back, but I will see it and hear it go by, and then I will suddenly vanish for about 5 minutes or 4 minutes. So, but please go ahead.
Okay. So it sounded like we were asking ourselves the question: issues of importance. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And so I agree with what Kelly and the rest of the group said about PJ and cheatgrass. I'd also note wet meadow habitat protection or enhancement is another issue. And then grazing, I think, is important for 3 reasons. 1, it can be related to cheatgrass. 2, it can be related to wet meadows. And 3, it's very socially and politically important.
Yes. After the BLM's recent adventures in the last week in Nevada.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess the question for Holly and Greg is, what will be the most efficient way for the steering committee and the research group to kind of come up with those questions of how to focus the workshop? Is it, like me getting together, with the folks that are in Reno and kind of, taking them to that exercise that Holly was talking about? Is it something that we should consider doing in the next webinar?
Yeah, can you put up that timeline again up on the screen just so we can all
Yep.
see that?
Let me take a look. There you go.
It seems like if you could do something with folks there before our next webinar, because having that question, getting a sense of that, the scope of the focus question, would help decide kind of how broad or scope the conceptual model needs to be.
And Holly, you had some references I noticed on your screen. Maybe actually having some of those references for us to look at beforehand and get familiar with the process a little more.
The references, I think Greg had some for the ACT, those papers by Molly Cross, and then the National Park Service's scenario planning guidebook or scenario.
There was one for the Southwest I saw. It was on one of your slides. And
it was the Southwest technical assessment.
Yeah.
Which I have a copy of in my office,
Okay.
Patty, that I can loan you.
If there's a link that we could just look it up, and then we would be more familiar with the process. It's hard to, get your head wrapped around these 2 different processes with just a couple of webinars.
What real quick, because I sense the school bus coming. What I am in the process of doing is getting a web page for the project through IT, and I'll have everything up there. So I'll have all the supporting material, and there's the school bus. So I'm going to disappear for about 4 minutes, and I'll be right back.
Okay.
Could I? This is Julie. Could I suggest that we were Tamara was going around asking all the steering committee members what they would suggest for a focal area. Can we finish that process? Because we didn't hear from Susan, we didn't hear from Dale, and I don't know who else we didn't hear from.
Okay.
But if we could just, while she's gone, hear from the other people what they think is a good thing to focus on, a good focal area.
Okay, this is Susan. I mean, all the ideas that folks have put forward so far, I think are spot on, and I like the idea of us really trying to, instead of focusing on something that perhaps is more narrow, but instead to look at a topic or kind of area that just has a lot of possible implications and connections. And I think everything that folks have mentioned, the pinyon juniper expansion, cheatgrass, grazing, sage grouse, they're all connected to each other. And I think if we look at it at something complicated like that, it's going to give us the most useful results and things that we can potentially use in management.
Thank you. How about Dale? We didn't hear from Dale.
Yeah.
Is he still there? Okay.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, like I said, I'm filling in for Steve, and I think probably he was thinking about the bi-stage sage grouse when he got into this and stuff. So what Susan said and what was it Jim, the other man that mentioned the bi-stage sage grouse? That seems like a useful place for us to, it'd be useful for us because, we're over in California and stuff, and so we're probably have a little bit different issues than some other people, but that seems like it would be something we'd be interested in.
Okay. That's everybody, right? Holly, sorry, I interrupted. You were going to say something when I asked my question.
I think it was just about getting the documents out, making sure that we had which kind of reports or publications that we were going to be sending around or providing links for folks, and kind of finishing that up. So that was the Southwest Assessment Technical Report, and then the papers that Greg referenced about the ACT process, and then I would say the National Park Service Scenario Guidebook.
And maybe Greg also had a workshop report that he referred to. That might also be helpful if that's available.
Yeah, so I can get all those workshop reports together. Yeah.
Yes, the one other item that we should probably have available is the REA, some sort of description or just information about the REA.
And then if there's anything about sort of trying to arrange Tamara connecting with people to go through this focus, kind of this issue tree activity that helps us hone in on the management questions or the focus question. I don't know whether you want to try to set that up or just if we're deciding that that's kind of what we're doing between now and the next webinar.
That sounds like a good plan to figure it out between, well, in order to do the next webinar, because we're going to do the diagram, the conceptual model, we need to know what we're doing a conceptual model of and have a preliminary one that we provide.
Right. So the expectation is that Tamara will connect with each one of you, either individually or in some grouping.
This is what happens when you leave the conversation. You get assigned work.
Yeah, this is it. Yeah, so that in between now and the next webinar, Tamara, I guess that you'll be connecting with people individually or in whatever group kind of organization that makes sense for folks to try to go through that management issue exercise.
Okay.
And then we can use that to inform the next webinar, which is about doing the conceptual diagram.
But
it'll help us get other diagrams together, like to build on, so that we don't necessarily have to start from scratch.
So while you were gone, Tamara, we asked the other two members of the steering committee that we hadn't heard from what their focal area they would choose. And it sounds like people are really pretty well in agreement about PJ and cheatgrass and sage grouse. So that's a place to start with. There is a certain amount of agreement already.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's just really coming up with the questions.
Yeah, so that'd be the place to start, and then to say, if you go from there and then go the next level up, what might be the specific questions that you would be focused on there. And then if you went from that level of cheatgrass, PJ, in the meadows and so on, and sage grouse downwards in more detailed areas, then what would those sets of questions be? And then once you've kind of mapped that out, then you come up with your final question or set of questions. That's your focus.
Okay.
And what that does is it helps kind of identify that range. It acknowledges that there is a range of focus and that you can apply these approaches to any of those levels going forward. So it's
well, I think that we need that diversity for this process as well.
Yeah.
So I've got to go, Tamara.
Okay.
Thank you very much for convening the call.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Greg. Well, and I think it's 2 minutes to 4, and we said this would be done by 4. So, are there any other questions or comments that folks would like to make?
Thank you for putting this all together, Tamara.
Thank you, Tamara.
And have a great weekend.
And thanks to all of our steering committee members who participated.
Yep.
Yeah, we can't do it without you. And so, yeah, I hope this is a fun process, and it's definitely something that's kind of, I'm not going to say novel, but, you know, just definitely kind of intriguing, and will be interesting for you guys to go through. So I'll contact everybody that's local. Is Dale still on?
He just left.
Okay. So I'll contact Dale, and then Steve Nelson.
I'm on the phone. I'm just not on the screen.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. So I'll contact you guys, and we can set up something remote, since I know you guys are both down in Bishop. And I'll be getting in touch with everybody probably early next week to kind of get this rolling. Tentative dates for the second webinar would be the 5th or the 12th of May. But I will also get those doodle polls sent out to everybody so we can nail that stuff down and just get it on everybody's calendars as well.
All right. Okay. Sounds
I can send you an email and let you know, but if we do it on the 12th, I'd prefer it to be in the afternoon if we could.
Yes, I have. Actually, that was one of the notes from some of the research team, that the afternoon on the 12th was the best. So that lines up nicely. All right, but I will get those sent out. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thanks,
Thank you. Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.
Yep. Bye.